What up, AP Psych? Welcome to your third set of notes for our development unit. This one's going to be on cognitive development. You've already gone over the psychosocial stages of development, some developmental milestones, and this one's going to be all about cognition and how our thought processes develop across our lifespan. We'll have two major theories to talk about in this one. One we'll go into in much more depth than the other, and the other has a little bit more relevance to educational psychology and the way classrooms are run today. So equally as interesting, just not as large and detailed. So to start off, we're going to start with the theory by Jean Piaget, and he studied children's developing cognition and all of their mental activities associated with thinking, knowing, remembering, and communicating. Here he is. He is a discontinuous developmental psychologist, so he believed that development happened in those regimented stages based on different age ranges. And he developed a theory of cognitive development outlining 4 key stages, which we'll get into each one of those. He introduced the concept of schemas, which we're all familiar with from our cognition unit. He identified key processes like assimilation and accommodation that allows us to develop and children to develop their schemas and their understanding of the world. He showed that children's thinking is qualitatively different from that of adults and how it evolves over time, which is the important piece of cognitive development. And he emphasized the importance of active learning through discovery and hands-on experience in childhood. And he thought that individual experiences and exploratory learning were keys to cognitive development. So a couple important terms we'll start with. We all know schemas, right? They're our cognitive framework for how we organize and interpret information and the world around us, and we build them throughout our lives to better understand the world as we grow. So how do we change those schemas, right? When we talked in cognition, we talked about concepts, and within concepts we had schemas and we had prototypes. So how do we change and interpret those things? Well, when you have an understanding of the world around you, you can only learn and change that understanding through experience. One of those experiences is assimilating information that you can connect to information that already exists in your mind. So assimilation is the process of incorporating new information into your existing schema, fitting these new pieces into familiar categories to understand them better. So for example, imagine a kid has a schema for a dog, right? They know that dogs are furry animals with 4 legs and they bark. When they see a poodle for the first time, never seen a poodle before, they can easily identify it as a dog because they've seen it as other types of dogs, and it fits their schema. It's a furry animal, it's 4 legs, and it barks. So it works, and they can just take that information and fit it into their schema for dogs. Nothing has to change. But what happens when a child encounters something new? That's called accommodation, where we alter our existing schema or create new ones to adapt to new information that doesn't fit an existing category, right? For example, that same kid has never seen a cat before, goes to a friend's house, sees a cat for the first time, calls it a dog because it's furry, has 4 legs, hasn't heard it make a sound yet, he's just assuming it's a dog. However, he gets corrected, right? When his parents or somebody tells him, hey, listen, this cow or this cat meows, right, instead of barks. So it might have 4 legs, and fur, but it makes a different sound, and it's a different species, right? They realize that cats are a different type of animal. So they then modify their schema or accommodate so they have a different understanding of dogs and cats, creating a new category or new schema for cats, right? So if we go back to cognition, you might have a concept of animals, and then a schema for dogs, schema for cats, and a prototype for both. And the more you experience as you learn and grow, the more your schemas are assimilated and accommodated and changed, right? And that's why Piaget heavily emphasizes exploratory learning, individual exploration, to start to develop your schemas and your cognitive understanding as you grow. So getting into his stages. The 4 stages are sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. We'll get into all of these in a little bit more detail, and here are the associated age ranges. First up, sensory motor stage. This is birth to 2 years of age, right? And this is when infants learn about the world through sensory experiences and motor exploration. That's why it would be called sensory motor stage, right? Just like this kid. Little kids want to put everything in their mouth. They want to crawl everywhere, explore everything when they can. That's the sensory motor stage. So imagine a baby who's only a few months old. They start to understand their environment by reaching out for colorful toys, shaking rattles, touching things, putting things in their mouth. That's how they learn, right, at this stage of development, the sensory motor stage. Within this stage, infants don't quite yet understand something called object permanence. So this is a key term, it might help you with some of your vocab. This is the understanding that objects continue to exist even when they cannot be seen, heard, or touched. This is developing during the sensory motor stage. So if you catch an infant early enough in the first year, that's why they love peekaboo so much, right? Because they literally think you disappear when your face is blocked. They don't understand that you're not there anymore, right? Or if they're playing with a toy you don't want them to play with, you just take the toy and you hide it. And in their mind, it doesn't exist anymore, right? Because they have not yet developed object permanence or an understanding that objects exist when they're out of sight. Interesting developmental phenomenon in the sensory motor stage. Okay. Up next is your pre-operational stage. So in this stage, this is ages 2 to 7, where children develop language, start to think symbolically, and their imagination takes off, right? But they struggle with anything logical and understanding other people's perspectives. So kids are going to have a lot of imaginative play and things like that, but they're not going to understand how to think from someone else's perspective yet. So let's look at some of the key developmental aspects of this stage. You have pretend play, right? Children are acting out scenarios, they're role-playing situations, they're using their imagination, developing creativity, social skills, symbolic thinking. Piaget would say this is one of the most important parts of cognitive development because you're getting creative and helping your push your understanding of the world around you by imagining and interacting in different ways, right? So using that symbolic thinking to act out certain roles, right, in pretend play. Second, you got parallel play. So kids at age 2 to 7, if you've noticed, if you've been around the kids that age very often, they don't like to play together. They don't like to share, but they will play next to each other, right? They're going to play alongside each other without directly interacting, each focused on their own activity, but observing and imitating others, right? That observational learning we're talking about, kids are always watching and trying to do things that others are doing, but at this point, they're very individualistic. They don't want to work together yet. They don't want to play together yet. That's going to come later, okay? So they're going to be playing separately with their own set of blocks, just like these two guys, right? And maybe watching each other and trying to imitate them, but they're not necessarily going to want to share and they're not going to want to work together. That's that parallel play. But they're still doing a lot of cognitive advancement through imitation. Then we have animism. This is a belief in your early childhood that children attribute lifelike qualities like feelings and intentions to inanimate objects, right? That's part of that pretend play and that creativity, but they're working with stuffed animals or Barbie dolls or whatever they might be playing with, and they give them names and they give them life stories and they give all of these real humanistic qualities to these inanimate objects, right? That's their animism, the belief that they can make these things lifelike. And then we have egocentrism in this stage as well. Egocentrism is the stage where children struggle to see things from another person's point of view. They're egocentric. They think everyone knows what they know, right? So an example of this might be a young child coloring a picture, feeling proud of their work. They're going to say, hey, mom and dad, don't you love what I'm drawing here? And talk about it and assume that their parents can see exactly what they see because they physically and cognitively cannot understand that if other people are not seeing what they're seeing, they can't think from their perspective, right? They think everyone sees what they see and thinks about the world in the way that they do. That's egocentrism. But as this stage goes on, children start to develop theory of mind, right? Which is the ability to understand that others have thoughts, feelings, and perspectives different from their own. So this starts typically developing around ages 4 to 5 when they can start taking other people's perspectives and understand that, oh, I see the world this way, or I know this about the world, but that doesn't mean that other people do too, right? And that's when they can start to really interact with others and think about maybe playing with others more because they can take their perspectives with theory of mind. Our third stage is the concrete operational stage. Concrete is where logic comes into play. You can think concretely. Children develop logic, think about concrete objects, and understand concepts like conservation and reversibility. This is ages 7 to 11, kind of that late elementary, early middle school range. So you might imagine in this stage, during a class discussion about rules and fairness, a teacher explains a situation where a child broke a classroom rule, but had a good reason, such as needing to help a friend. However, students in the concrete operational stage respond by saying the rule breaker should still face consequences because rules are rules. They can only think concretely. They cannot think abstractly about, things like justice and ethics and what's right and wrong. They only know rules are rules, right? Their thinking remains concrete and rigid. In addition, they develop an understanding of conservation, right? Which is the idea that certain properties of objects like volume or mass remain consistent despite changes in form or appearance. This typically develops in this stage. And you can test this if you have anyone that you know who's younger in that 7 to 11 year old range or younger. You could have 2 cups of water. One's really tall and skinny, one's really short and fat. And you could take the tall and skinny one that's filled up to the brim and pour it into the skinny fat one, and you could ask which one had more water in it, and they're going to say the skinny tall one because it looks like it has more, even though the amount of water doesn't change, because they don't understand conservation yet. Right? We'll watch a couple of videos in class that show this in real time. Another thing in this stage, reversibility. They start to understand that they can mentally reverse an action or an operation. Objects can be returned to their original state. Typically, this develops in the concrete operational stage. For example, if you take a piece of Play-Doh and you push it out into like a pancake, essentially, before this stage, kids are not going to believe that it can go back to what it was, right? It becomes that pancake, that flat round circle, and they're like, oh, that's just what it is now, right? They cannot think past that really concrete, straightforward way of thinking. But as they get towards the end of this stage, they realize that, oh, I can just take that and reform it and then make it into whatever I want. So these are some interesting cognitive developmental terms that happen at each stage as we go. Our last stage, the one that you're all in right now, hopefully, is formal operational stage. And this is where individuals develop the ability to think abstractly, solve hypothetical problems, use deductive reasoning, think in terms of what is right morally, what is just, maybe can you break a law but have a good reason? You could start thinking abstractly in that way, right? So a group of teenagers can start engaging in debate club and argue about government policies on climate change. They analyze hypothetical situations, propose solutions, reducing greenhouse gases and all of these things, right? They can think about hypothetical problems and work for potential solutions that prior to the age of 12, they wouldn't have been able to do because they're so concrete and logical, or they just don't have the cognitive function to even get to that point up until then. So that is Piaget, right? His discontinuous stages of cognitive development over time and the different highlights of each stage. Our second theorist is Lev Vygotsky, and he was a developmental psychologist known for his sociocultural theory of development, where he says social interaction plays a critical role in cognitive development, and he emphasized the importance of culture, language, and the zone of proximal development. He is the opposite of Piaget in the sense that Piaget thought development happened mostly independently, right, in stages. Vygotsky would say you need society and the people around you to help you develop slowly over time. He does not associate any ages with cognitive development, but he emphasizes that importance of the village helping children develop, right? So we've got the different nature of development here happening in stages, discontinuously with Piaget. It's continuous with Vygotsky. The social interaction is limited with Piaget. He believes it's mostly an independent pursuit of cognitive development, where Vygotsky says there's going to be a zone of proximal development, which we'll talk about in a second, where others need to help you, right? And the role of adults and peers in Piaget's situation is minimal, where there's active guidance in Vygotsky. So Vygotsky is very social in his theory of cognitive development. And his first term is scaffolding. He's very influential in educational psychology, right? Scaffolding is a teaching method where a knowledgeable person provides tailored support to help a learner achieve a new skill, gradually reducing assistance as the learner becomes more proficient. You guys are very familiar with scaffolding, even if you don't really realize it. Your teachers provide scaffolding all the time. For us, thinking about how we scaffolded you into writing an AAQ or writing an EBQ and working together as groups and then trying them individually and giving you cues and clues here and there, or in your history classes or English classes, getting formulas for writing a thesis statement or how to write an essay, or in your math classes, using formulas to help you get to the point where you can do those things independently. That's scaffolding people through the learning process. And then you have scaffolding is meant to help in what's known as the zone of proximal development. This is the range between what a learner can do by themselves and what they can achieve with guidance, right? This emphasizes the importance of that social interaction and learning that Vygotsky emphasizes so much. So if you imagine this circle, it's what the learner can do without help, right? The things that you know you can do that you've already learned, you don't need any help to do anymore. But in this middle circle, there's things that you can potentially do, but you're going to need help with, right? And that's where society comes into play. And then outside of that, things you can't do yet, okay? So think of as you go through, let's say, math classes, for example. You start with algebra. Once you can do algebra, it's like, okay, let's move to algebra 2 with the help of a teacher. That's in our zone of proximal development. But you cannot yet get to calculus, right? You need help from someone who knows what they're doing to aid you to get to the next step so you can slowly grow and expand your circle of knowledge. Right? There's another example over here as well if you want to take a second to read about a sports example and use those for your vocab. Our last thing has nothing to do with Piaget, has nothing to do with Vygotsky. Vygotsky's his theory is pretty short, right? Just those three major things. The sociocultural theory, which includes scaffolding and zone of proximal development, right? But as we get to the end of our life and the end of our cognitive development, we talked about crystallized and fluid intelligence, right, and how that shifts. That's part of our development over time. And eventually, as we get towards our end of life, some people will experience dementia, right, which is a decline in cognitive functioning. So that is a type of cognitive development, right? It's just a decline instead of an increase. And this interferes with daily life, characterized by memory loss, impairment in judgment, and difficulties in communicating and reasoning, often seen in older adults. When we think of dementia, probably the most common example that we think of is Alzheimer's disease. Right? So that wraps up our cognitive development across the lifespan. Our two major theorists, Piaget, we're going to get into significantly more in class. Vygotsky, we're not going to touch on much more, but I would highlight those terms, especially scaffolding and zone of proximal development. And as usual, let us know if you have any questions, and we'll see you in class.